Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for that presentation. So it's clear that the journey of improving safety, especially in preventing falls from height, has been both challenging and rewarding over the past 50 years. The HSE's ongoing commitment to ensuring that everyone returns home safely at the end of the day truly resonates with the value we hold dear at PASMA. We look forward to continuing our collaboration with the HSE as we face the challenges of the future together. And now, ladies and gentlemen, as we approach the final segment, I know you're going to be thinking this is it, big build up. It's actually my favourite part of the whole afternoon. So, the final segment. Over the past 50 years, PASMA has seen tremendous growth and transformation, shaping the industry standards and setting the benchmark for safety and training in the mobile access industry. The journey has been marked by key moments, pivotal decisions, innovation in manufacturing, changing legislation, and the dedication of individuals who have been steering PASMA to where it is today. It is my great pleasure to introduce the final session for today, one that I'm sure will resonate deeply with all of us who have been there and enjoyed some of the journey with them. We have the privilege of hearing from a panel of distinguished individuals who have played a significant role in PASMA's evolution and history. Together, they will be sharing their recollections of some of the key moments in PASMA's history, providing us with insights into the decisions and experiences they have shaped our future. So the panel will be made up of Richard Fairfield, our immediate past chair, Peter Bennett, OBE, MD of PASMA and a former chair, Peter Bond, a former chair, Paul Pritchard, another former chair, and finally Paul Gallagher, yet another former chair. So we've got a lot of chairs. And I'm waiting for the chairs to arrive on stage as soon as they do. So without further ado, please join me when the chairs are ready for the welcome to the stage, Richard, Peter, Paul and Paul. It sounds like a bit of a band, but... There we go.
A fall from height. That's what started it. Alan rang me. He said, Mike, there's been an accident. One of my climber Lloyd towers. Goodness gracious me, guess how high it was? 8 feet. If it's preventable, then it's a disaster. Is it accidental or is it preventable? This can't go on. I said, we need a trade association.
Mike was giving us an example of why the association was formed in the first place, and sadly it was because of a fatality. So this fatality was someone had climbed up the outside of a tower and the tower had fallen back on him, and he'd fallen, hit his head on the concrete and sadly died. Now that was only 8 feet or 2.5 metres.
In those days, there were no standards whatsoever.
The Health and Safety at Work Act had come in 1974, and that was a big driver for companies to improve their safety performance and safety policies.
People that got together wanted to improve the industry. And in those days, PASMA was Prefabricated Aluminium Scaffold Manufacturers Association.
You can see why we shortened it down to PASMA.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Unlike previous sessions, this afternoon's we will not tell you how to do anything. We will not talk about any standards or anything in terms of giving you advice. This is an unashamedly nostalgic trip down memory lane. PASMA over the last 50 years, like many organisations, has not seen growth at a steady pace. At times, there have been periods of stagnation, and at times there have been periods of dramatic innovation and rapid change. And we're going to look at some of those periods and see what influence they had on the development of the association. I am officially the world's worst person at remembering names, So PASMA have been very kind to me this afternoon. They have given me 4 panellists, 2 of whom are called Paul and 2 of whom are called Peter. So I have a 50-50 chance of getting it right if I speak to any one of them. So I've also got a 50-50 chance of getting it wrong, of course. Paul Pritchard, we've heard talk this afternoon. Paul was involved in PASMA from the very, very early days. In fact, I have an apology to make, and that is that we looked for a panel who could cover all 50 years of PASMA's development. Paul's already said he didn't attend until meeting 4, so we've only been able to cover 49 years, 6 months. So we've failed on the first step. But Paul worked with Stevens and Carter and was chair in the late 70s and early 80s. Peter Bond, from SGB Youngman, we've established, I think, finally, Peter, that you were chair in the early noughties, although your involvement with PASMA started back in the late 80s. Yeah. Peter Bennett, OBE, everybody knows Peter. I'm sure what some of you may not know is that before Peter became the managing director of PASMA, he was in fact PASMA's chairman for a couple of years, I think in 1999, 2000. And that means, are you the youngest member of the panel, Paul? Paul Gallagher recently retired as sales director from Pop-Up Products, was chair of PASMA in the mid-noughties. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel. Paul, can we start with you?
You must.
Whenever I talk to anybody who was involved with PASMA in the very, very early days, there are 2 things that stick out to me. One is that here were 4 companies that competed ferociously commercially, and yet they were prepared to put their differences to one side, to come together, to sit around the table for the greater good. And the second thing is the association was entirely amateur. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I mean that nobody was paid, everybody was a volunteer, meetings were held in all sorts of weird and wonderful places. So what were the early days really like?
Well, 2 questions in one there. Addressing the first one, I mean, you've got to think back to what life was like in 1974. There were 2 general elections, a hung parliament, a 3-day week, a shortage of petrol, and the Health and Safety at Work Act was brought in. So there was a lot going on at that time. And we'd only just got over decimalisation, which had happened 3 years earlier. So there was a lot going on at that time. And it was a struggle for any company to really survive at the time. So it was an interesting time, a challenging time, and there was a lot to be dealt with. But all of the companies involved had been touched by accidents and safety issues. There's been reference to those before, but if you look back at the falls from height figures from that time in the 70s, we were looking at between 300 and 400 people a year dying from falls from heights, compared with the 40 or 50. So, yeah, we were all familiar with the problems and the dangers and the risks at that time. So we were all sort of interested not only in developing this wonderful new product, which an aluminium tower was, but in trying to make it safer as well. So that was the first part of it. The second part of the question about why we met in weird and wonderful places was driven by partly by the economy again. No companies had a lot of money to spend on marketing and nice meeting venues. So we met wherever it was cheap and cheerful to meet. And the first few meetings were held at the Excelsior Hotel at Heathrow in John Russley's bedroom, basically. He'd be flying in and out from Ireland to the UK, and he'd stop overnight, and in the morning we'd have the PASMA meeting in his bedroom. And my first meeting that I attended as a precocious 11-year-old, I think I was at the time, was having to move the greasy breakfast tray with congealed egg and bacon rind off the chair and stick it on the bed so I could sit down and join the meeting, So they were very basic times.
And of course, there was no money in the association, was there?
No, we had no money at all to start with. And then I think each company chipped in about £30 each, I think, later, in a few years' time. And that was to cover the stamps, basically, because we'd send out letters to people and we'd maybe rent a room somewhere later on. But it really was penny pinching days.
And what about trust? Because there must have been issues of confidentiality and product review, etc., that these companies were not willing to discuss. Was there a feeling of distrust, or?
Of course, we all distrusted each other. We were all trying to get one up on each other, but we had a common interest in promoting towers as a product and in improving safety, because we realised that this product was never going to really succeed unless it brought some advantages over the other products that were around at the time. Because you've got to remember that we were looking at selling aluminium towers, which cost a lot of money in those days, compared with tube and clamps, which were priced in shillings and pence. So it was quite a hard sell and quite a difficult thing to promote.
And there'd be some commercial issues that were off the agenda and couldn't be talked about, such as pricing, etc.
We never talked about pricing, not ever collude. No, that wouldn't have happened. Although I do remember on one occasion, one company agreed to move their prices at the same time as another company that I might have happened to work for at the time. And we moved our prices, and they were due to move theirs not at the same time, because that would be too obvious, but maybe a month later. But they didn't. And they rubbed their hands and they said, well, we've really wrong-footed them in this occasion. But the laugh was on them, because we put our prices up 10% and our customers paid it.
And it worked.
And it worked. So we actually made more profit. So they never tried that again.
Good for you.
No names mentioned, obviously.
Of course not. So moving on, Peter, let me ask you.
But just before you do that, when Paul talked about other locations, he didn't mention the pole dancing place.
We didn't get this in rehearsal.
One of the companies had an area with poles in there where they used to bring in ladies to practice pole dancing. I'll say no more than that. Sorry, I interrupted you.
That's a conversation later for the bar, I think, isn't it? So,
That is a very reasonable explanation for it.
I don't think I want to know. I think it's better leaving it to the imagination. So, okay, all businesses in a way, particularly trade associations, struggle for legitimacy when they're young. But in the 80s and early 90s, PASMA was heavily involved in the development of standards such as HD 1004, etc. To what extent did that give PASMA a leadership and a guidance in the eyes of the industry?
There are a few things on that, I think. The first thing I should say, though, is it started with the technical committee in 1983, and they started without me. So I came in a little bit after that. And if you saw the video that Paul showed, which features me, you can see I was too young for most of
Very young.
Right. But it's worth saying that HD 1004 in those discussions were well advanced when I came into it. And I came in from a large manufacturer who had a lot of confidence, a lot of influence. They were a sort of mover and shaker in some ways, but they don't have a real voice on this kind of subject unless they get together with other companies. And that's exactly what was happening. We now had several manufacturers involved in discussing HD 1004. And it was a really important part of that sort of stage. And in a way, although it still took 20 years from start to finish to get in the end document produced, once they also joined forces with the rental companies, the training organisations and other specialists, really PASMA had a really powerful voice in the industry. But even back in HD 1004 times, PASMA had begun to establish its authority, I think, through the Code of Practice. And the Code of Practice went back to 1980. Really, from that point on, no other organisation tried to compete with PASMA. Throughout most of its time, its voice has been so strong that even in places like Europe, you had no comparable organisation. We looked to try and marry up with other organisations across the world, and there weren't any. So it's not surprising that we had the Health and Safety Executive talking to PASMA in a fairly detailed way. And we were trying to stop things like the French putting what they call crinolines into towers. These are these hooped supports to the ladders. They were talking about trying to make sure the wind levels that applied to scaffolds. And the Europeans saw towers as scaffolds, not as the lightweight tower mobile structures that they are. So in terms of the wind factors, there were those sort of discussions going on as well. And really, even once HD 1004 became a reality, there were immediately events being run around the country. Suppliers, manufacturers running fairly major events with huge numbers. I found it incredible to be speaking to audiences of 100 people in a room about a standard, and that doesn't normally happen. And I think the authority that PASMA had already gained on HD 1004 gave that credibility that helped that whole platform. And PASMA didn't stop with HD 1004, though. It went on to produce these other standards that cover a whole range of different applications. We've already heard about some of them. Link towers, cantilevers, tall towers, room scaffolds, podium steps. Those have all been milestones, really important foundations that PASMA has been involved with, giving it added authority along the way. Which, almost to finish, it's worth saying that we should ask ourselves the question, does it matter? Do all those standards actually make a difference? Well, they really do, because what they establish is a sort of robust technical performance criteria for that whole side of the industry. Its stability, its strength, it's looking at dimensions, it's looking at materials. So it's the quality and safety for our tower industry that has come through the activity of PASMA. So that in many ways gives it authority. And the last thing I'd say is that even today, clearly PASMA does have quite a lot of influence, because the British Standards Committee that I sit on has a new chairman. And this is the effect, the influence of PASMA, because Don Ayres is the new chairman of the main access and support parent body of many of the work at height and other structural issues. And I think that's no mean feat to have PASMA influence. So it's a long answer, but that's my view on it.
So we'd had the Code of Practice, and then we'd had the development of all the training schemes, and here was PASMA taking a much wider industry authoritative position in the lead and the development of the interpretation of these standards.
Exactly. You can't doubt the impact of all that. It shows the leadership role, the authority that PASMA has had.
Peter, you were chair 1999-2000.
Correct.
And PASMA, as we've heard earlier, started off as a prefabricated aluminium scaffold and manufacturers association, but you changed it. It became the Prefabricated Access Suppliers and Manufacturers Association with the introduction of suppliers as full members. Why were those changes made, and what effect did they have?
So, as you say, I was the chair 1999-2000, and at that time there was a 1 year term of office. We've subsequently changed it. It's a 2 year term of office. But to put that into context, at that time, PASMA had, I don't know, maybe a dozen or so manufacturing members, a couple of dozen associate members who were non-voting members, generally, I think, rental or tool hire companies. But in the intervening 25 years or so, the route to market had changed completely. In the early days, manufacturers were the main route to market. They were the main supplier of towers on rental and in sales. But in the intervening period, that changed completely, and the main route to market was via third parties. So manufacturers were selling equipment to rental companies primarily, and then they would get to the market from there. At that time, the training scheme had been developed, and the manufacturers had been labouring under the misguided belief that only they had received wisdom to be able to train people in the use of the towers that they manufactured. And part of the issue that I saw was that we really needed to change that. We really needed to adapt, or else we would become totally irrelevant. As I said, the majority of equipment that's being used was coming from third-party organisations, and they needed to be part of it. They needed to be part of the organisation for it to be relevant. As you would probably expect, given it was a manufacturers industry or a manufacturers association, there was a bit of reluctance to let go of it. In fact, there was a bit of concern about it, and we had a job to do to convince the manufacturers that it was in their interest to do so. But when we present the challenge of really what is this organisation about, and if it is, as you say it is, if it's about promoting safe use of the equipment that you guys manufacture, then you cannot argue with the logic that the more training you make available via as many centres as possible, the more people you're going to train, and the better it's going to be for everybody. That argument did prevail, but we needed to put in some safeguards for manufacturers. As we said, it was their organisation, and we were asking them to basically give it over to other rental companies, training organisations and such like. So we had to build in some safeguards to our constitution or to our articles, which meant that manufacturers, you will never lose control of it. You will always have half of the council. And secondly, we needed to build in some other safeguards, which was to guarantee the quality of the training that would be provided. And we've done that by putting into place procedures, by putting into place requirements for instructors, by putting into place requirements for centres, the minimum requirements they would have to meet. And although at the time it was quite a tough ask to push it through, we did manage to persuade the council, and although there had been misgivings, in the intervening 20-odd years, pretty much, in fact we don't count, we don't even know how many there are, but certainly the biggest proportion of chairs of the organisation in the intervening period have been from other than manufacturers, from training organisations, from rental companies, from hire and assembly. Hire and assembly have had a pretty good run at it as well. And the organisation has not suffered from it. In fact, it's gone on from strength to strength. And if you look at it from the training perspective, in the couple of years prior to us making those changes, the average that was being trained in a year was a pretty impressive at that time, 3,000 delegates per year. Last year and in this coming year, we'll probably train about 80,000 delegates per year. And last year, we trained our millionth delegate. So it's not had any adverse effects on the organisation.
But there wasn't universal agreement. There was disagreement at council level as to the change from manufacturers.
Correct. And you see that this is a recurring theme. That when we want to lead, and somebody said this before, as an organisation, we've always taken the view that we should be leading, and we should be doing our bit to push things on, to move things, not because it's easy, but because it's the right thing to do. But people generally don't like change, and you generally face a little bit of pushback when you try to change things.
And in the end, were you able to convince people, or was this sort of driven through with various members of council having reservations?
I think there probably were reservations, but it was quickly dissipated because, as I say, in the coming years, forget, we weren't happy about that in the first place. But in actual fact, things are going well. We can see that things are progressing the way that we would like them to go. In fact, probably doing better than we expected them to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can vouch for that because I was at that meeting and there were a lot of abstentions.
Were there? Right. So they didn't come out vehemently against it. They just chose not to support it.
Exactly.
Okay, but nevertheless, it went through. So PASMA started the new millennia as an organisation for manufacturers and suppliers, and it was a period of significant change, wasn't it? The noughties. Now, Paul, you were chair in the mid-noughties. PASMA at that stage was still, let's call it a mobile organisation. It was moving around for functions in different places. You were chair when the decision was made to purchase an administrative centre or a head office building in Glasgow.
Yeah, there was quite a lively debate about, first of all, spending the money on the premises, but we were leasing it, so leasing different premises, and we were meeting and subcontracting things out. So we had the money in the bank, and we decided that we needed a premises to send a message to the industry of our future plans and growth and our position in the industry as the organisation to go to on Tower. So if anybody wanted anything to know about Tower, PASMA were the organisation. So we looked at various places, and I remember the meeting clearly. There's some voices of, well, should we be in Glasgow, where PASMA office already was, or staff were already, and Peter and the team? Should we be in London? Should we be in Birmingham? Anyway, we finally agreed that it'd be a good idea to be in Glasgow because that's where the team were already. And we did get consensus on that in the end. We had a lively debate about it, but we didn't have a question about whether or not we should do it or not. It was more about the location. But the decision was taken at the time to reinforce PASMA's position in the industry, to reflect the future going forward, security for the staff, security for the members, and really for us to be recognised as the organisation for towers alongside people like IPAF with powered access and the NASC. And as was said earlier, working very closely with the HSC, Peter and the team and all the people on the council's committees changed. I mean, I remember going to my first meeting, council meeting, as a manufacturer there, and we were NSG at the time, scaffolding. And I remember sitting there and thinking, blimey, these meetings go on for a long time, don't they? And I'm not joking, I mean, 6 or 7 hours. Eric Abbey, who was the secretary at the time, used to have a tape recorder, and he used to record all of it, God bless him. And how the hell he had the time then to write it all up afterwards. But what we did was we started to change our way of working. And we decided that rather than try and discuss everything in one meeting, we'd make up separate committees. And we decided to do that to be more effective and professional, so that now, as an idea, you know, our council meetings might last 3 or 4 hours. But there's already been technical meetings, there's been training meetings, there's been an exec meeting. But certainly for us at the time, going back to the premises, it was really important to give Peter a message to say, look, you know, this is what we're going to do in the team, and then the members. And I think the growth of it of PASMA since those days certainly reflects on the fact that we have a home in Glasgow, and that the team are there, and that we can be, it's not so much bricks and mortar, but it's more of an identity within the industry. And that decision was the right decision at the time. And I think that's proved to be certainly beneficial to us.
I think it has proven to be the right decision. I don't think it was believed universally that it was the right decision at the time.
Because there must have been some who would argue that it should be down in the southeast or maybe in the Midlands, because that's equidistant for everybody.
I think I've maybe discussed it with a few others before, that the precursor to Paul was talking about there was that I had already been engaged by the association on a self-employed basis to provide strategic management, and part of that was to have a look at and address the issue that we particularly faced at the time. Not a bad issue, I should say, which was that we were, as the number of training delegates was rising exponentially, so were our reserves. And we were sitting on rather substantial reserves that we really needed to address. And when I looked at it, I had reported back to council to say, look, you've got some limited options. First of all, any reserve you have must be applied to your objects. You're obliged by your article of association, and as a company limited by guarantee, whatever you're doing has to be directed towards your objects. We also don't want to take a punt on it. We couldn't take a punt on members' money. In the past, I think the BCCI banking collapse had not been too far before it. And so we were kind of looking at the situation where we needed to find something that would be a suitable investment that would apply to the objects, that would retain its value, maybe even appreciate in value. And that's what led us to property. We should buy property. But that also takes us to the next step, which is we're neither property speculators nor landlords. So that then takes us to the next logical thing. And again, many trade associations go through this stage where you're kind of drawn to the bit of we should take the step. We should take the step and employ our staff now, employ people that we can dedicate to providing a service to our members, and move away from what we'd been doing previously, which was to outsource it. Now, don't misunderstand me, the outsourcing had helped us considerably to get to the position we were at.
Because around about the same time you'd been appointed as PASMA's first managing director, and up until that stage, a lot of the function has been contracted out.
Correct.
And a lot of the operation was still, I described it as an amateur business. Mm-hmm. So this was PASMA beginning to become a professional business in its own right, was it?
It was indeed. And it was us getting to the situation where we were beginning to look at things strategically, and rather than just sort of deciding things as we went along, and taking Paul's point as well, having full-day meetings where the council was involved in micromanaging every aspect of it. It was to professionalise that and to, as I say, strategise it and look at it from the point of view of where do we want to go? Where do we see the organisation going? And again, at that time, I was tasked with putting together a 5-year strategy, which we did. That was quite interesting, quite painful as well. But when we put the 5-year strategy together, it helped us to get our minds around, right, how are we going to manage this growth? How are we going to manage where we're going to go? And as Paul's alluded to as well, that led us down the route of, look, we cannot have a council meeting for days on end. We need to streamline that. And how we streamline it is we set up committees, and those committees are tasked with certain things so that the council can concentrate on strategic, dealing only with high-level stuff and not the day-to-day running. That was possible because we established a staff, and a pretty dedicated staff, if I may say so myself.
Okay. It was really important at that time to just take a step back and become more professional as a business.
Yeah,
because we are a business. You know, our members are out there.
It's a business. We were making a lot of money.
Absolutely.
I remember some of those discussions. Every meeting we held, we were saying, we've got more money. We've got to spend it on members. What do we do with it?
Yeah. There was 1 year, I recall, I've told people this before, 1 year, I recall, when the bank interest rate was high, where the organisation made £30,000 on interest only. And when you're at that stage, that's when you say that we need to address that.
And when you started to bring in some of these services that had previously been contracted out,
yep.
Was there any resistance to that, or particularly from those providers who provided the services that you used to use?
Well, I can add a point there, because everyone's referred to, you know, there was quite a bit of tension. Should we do it? Where should we be located, etc.? And eventually that was resolved. But what happened then was all the council members one Saturday morning were served with writs by debt collector, but by a legal team. And I was sitting eating my breakfast, and my wife said, "Someone's just knocked at the door and served a writ on us. What have you been up to?" You know, and that sort of really made us closed ranks, and we thought, right, we're going to do this and do this properly.
And this was one of the outside suppliers who'd taken umbrage at
They were a bit miffed that we were going to take it in-house and they were going to lose a lot of lucrative income.
Well, we took a copy. Did you not take a copy of the
Yeah, we were keeping that under wraps.
the data?
No, we won't go back. I don't think no.
Because had you not, we wouldn't be operating the following day.
Yes, we had already anticipated that there may have been some resistance to it. So we had taken what was essentially our data and we copied the data. So that by the time we got to that situation, we already had their data sitting elsewhere. And in actual fact, what the contractor was trying to do was they were trying to hold us to ransom. And we were essentially able to defend ourselves and say, you will not be holding us to ransom. We'll, thank you, we'll operate
And did they eventually just back down, or did it end up in court?
It eventually did not go to court. Eventually it was settled out of court. And yeah, we moved on.
Okay. And one of the things as well, when we were looking at the premises and the cost of premises, we can imagine coming down to London and having a look at a premises and the cost of premises in London.
Yeah.
And we happened to found this lovely Victorian sort of Georgian building, and we looked at it, and first time we went to view it, we just sort of looked at it and said, that just seems to work. And Peter, well, it's handy for me. I'm only 5 minutes around the corner. So, but one question was asked, how many times we're going to go and meet at the office. And we said, well, really, how many times are we? The people that work in it will be meeting in it. But when will we as an organisation have council meetings there? Because it'd be easy to be in Birmingham or centrally based. And of course, we never...
Well, it was one of the specifications for it, that it needed to be, I think I mentioned before, one click out from an international airport. Because it was envisaged that we would need to get there for meetings. As you have rightly said, though, we've got a huge boardroom that's sitting there, and I think we've had 3 council meetings. Because, I mean, the contention that we made at the time was, and this is more so the case now, that communications, being as they are, doesn't matter what it is. And if you look at where we moved to now, not all, but virtual of our meetings are virtual.
So we with the benefit of hindsight now, we look back and think, that was a very, very valid decision to make. But at the time, it was quite a gamble, wasn't it?
It was. I don't know if it was a gamble. I certainly didn't think it was a gamble. My contention was, look, I can get the organisation more bang for the buck in Glasgow than I can in London. Yeah. You'll get a much better and a much higher quality of office for much less. And moreover, in the nicest possible way to people from the South East, I can get you staff who are going to be highly qualified, highly motivated, and I'll keep them. You might not be able to do that down in London, where in the nicest possible way, the employees move about a bit more.
So PASMA at that stage was still focusing on, I suppose, training and working on the standards, etc. The last 10 years have been a little bit different because we've seen a significant growth in the international business. We've seen the association start to look outside to its external social responsibilities with the establishment of the No Falls Foundation. We've seen PASMA attempting to influence legislation rather than just react to legislation through the sponsoring of the All-Party Parliamentary Group. And we've seen the establishment of a test and research centre. So have those changes been deliberate, and how do you do those without losing sight of your core function, which originally was to make sure that people use towers safely?
I think the main thing about that is that it reverts to something we said previously, and that is that we have always sought to lead from the front. We've always sought to look at what we do holistically and look at every aspect of what we're doing. So when we look at it from the point of view of Test and Research Centre, we established the Test and Research Centre in response to a perceived lack of technical support that we previously could rely upon from manufacturers, but which was diminishing. And indeed, we had some of our major manufacturers pretty much telling us, look, we can't carry this burden. All of these other manufacturers are reducing their technical capability, but it's then falling on us. So that kind of gave us the view, or kind of gave us the hint. If that technical support is not there, if the research is not available to support standards making, for instance, then we should step up to the mark and provide it as a sector. If we can't do that from a cooperative point of view as a lead industry body, it ain't going to be done by the manufacturers who just don't have the resource to do so. Go back to the situation talking about before on the no false foundation. No false foundation again stems from us fulfilling our societal duty, where it's not as simple as, you know, we're doing what we're doing in PASMA, we're training as many people as we can. What it does, what we're doing in the No False Foundation is recognising and owning the problem. We know that things can go wrong. We know that there are too many people who are being killed and injured as a result of falls from height. It has always been that way since I've been involved in the sector, although as Paul said, it's reduced quite considerably. That's us stepping up and being grown up and saying we need to do something about it. We need to make sure that we're putting effort in to make that, to stop that happening. What was the other one we're talking about? Oh, the APPG. The APPG, as you have rightly said, was in response to a realisation that we're always dealing, or we have always been dealing with legislation that's already in place and trying to do the best with it. The APPG was to try and get us in a position to say, well, look, why don't we see if we can perhaps influence it? And again, that was in response to, we know that work is dangerous because we hear about it all the time. But when people are asking us how big is the problem and where is the problem, the answer is we don't know because the data's not awfully good. We want to, and we renew our call from the APPG in the most recent one, and most recent meeting we had, is to have simplified riddle reporting that will give us that data, that will allow us to say, we need to put effort here, and we need to put effort there. And again, that's us taking a role a little bit, taking a lead role through accessing this forum as well, to say it's not just our issue, it's the whole work height sector. I'm going to shut up just now because I can see the time on there.
Paul, just a very quick question, because let's go right back to the beginning. Look at the organisation now. What do you think the original 4 companies who sat around that table would they be happy with what's happened? And has the association developed in a way that they could ever have imagined?
I think that they would never have imagined it developing the way it has now. But I think who couldn't be happy about the way it's developed and the results from, the number of people who were falling and being injured and killed in the early 70s to the situation now. It's a tenfold improvement. So who couldn't be happy about that?
And proud.
Yeah.
I'm proud. Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, apart from helping us this afternoon with our contribution, I think we should recognise the contribution that these gentlemen have made over the last 50 years to PASMA's development.
Thank you. Thanks, Buzz.